Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Crop It Like It's Hot. It's the first in a new series of breakfast events from us at Hubbub, designed to support people to engage the public and change behaviours around sustainability. If you're not familiar with us, Hubbub is a creative environmental charity, and we're all about inspiring action that's good for the environment and for everyone. My name is Alex Robinson, and I'm Hubbub's CEO, and I will be your host this morning. Now, today's session is more than just a clever title. We're going to be exploring how great design can help you have more impact. The short session, 45, 50 minutes, it's going to be fast-paced, and I hope it will leave you with some new ideas and some tips that you can put into practice in your own work. We have three special guests, so I'll warm them up a little bit with some questions, and then it's over to you for a Q&A for the bulk of the session. So please pop your questions into the Q&A box that you'll find at the bottom of the screen. The Q&A box is different to the chat box that you're probably used to using, and you'll find it next to the record button at the bottom. So onto our panel. I'm very lucky to be joined today by three highly qualified and very differently skilled guests too. So first up is Carol Feely. Carol is Executive Creative Director at Innocent Drinks. Innocent was founded in 1999, and they make little drinks which help people live well and die old. Carol's team is responsible for all of the creative work that you see across Europe, including packaging, comms, out of home, and digital. Next up is Tom Tapper, who is co-founder and CEO of Nice and Serious, which is a B Corp certified agency that makes creative work the world needs. Since 2008, he's worked with hundreds of purpose-driven brands and charities, including Innocent Drinks, Ben & Jerry's, Greenpeace, Nike, and recently, Hubbub, to creatively communicate the positive impact that they're having on the world. And finally, we have Eric Saldana, who is a creative partner in our design team at Hubbub. Eric has led the design of campaigns spanning topics from electronic waste, sustainable diets, and reuse. If you saw our very cheeky plastic butt campaign last year, that was Eric. And with a background in product design and mechanical engineering, Eric is driven by his curiosity and a desire to make the world a little bit more equitable. So thank you all and welcome. So I'm going to go into the first question. Carol, what is great design for you? And can you give us some examples?
Yeah, sure. So I think on a very basic level, design should be really simple and it should be really easy to understand. And I actually think that's incredibly hard to do. I think that applies to anything you're designing, whether that's a campaign, a piece of packaging, or even if you're an architect designing a space. It's all about solving a problem. And for me, the best pieces of design are when they solve a problem for everyone. And there's nothing better than when you find something that's been solved that you didn't even realize it was a problem yourself. And I think one of my favorite examples is a piece of packaging that was done, I think it was in 2017, so it's quite old, but it's actually by Herbal Essences, bizarrely. And they did some packaging for people with visual impairments. So imagine, if you're visually impaired and you're in the shower, the shampoo bottle and the conditioner bottle are exactly the same. So they did some research into it and they found that people were actually kind of doing their own kind of DIY hacks on their packaging, adding bits of tape or adding elastic bands. So what they did was super simple. They just added a bit of texture. So some stripes to the bottom of the shampoo bottle and some little dots to the conditioner bottle, just to kind of help people pull them apart. But what I love about that is that it's very inclusive, but it helps people with visual impairments, but it helps children. If they don't read, they can use kind of that feeling of touch. It can help elderly people, and it helps people, anyone who basically gets shampoo in their eyes. It helps them too. So I really love that as a piece of design, and just a really simple kind of cost-effective way to change something. And another one of my favorites is actually a piece of architecture in Milan. It's the vertical forest buildings, and they're two skyscrapers, and they look like basically two huge jungles, and they are beautiful pieces of architecture and amazing places to live because you're kind of surrounded by nature whilst you're in the city. But it's a really good example of a sustainable solution. It absorbs CO2. It helps kind of keep the building cool because it doesn't have as much glass. So it's you don't get kind of that magnifying effect that you get with glass. And it helps regulate the humidity as well. But I think it houses, the last time I checked, about 1,600 species. So it's a really great take on kind of modern biodiversity and how you can kind of explore sustainable architectural solutions within a city. And from a campaign point of view, this is an oldie, but it's a goodie, and I think we should all be reminded of it. It's you know, Patagonia. Their ability to communicate in an unexpected way is phenomenal, and I think particularly around sustainability, that's really hard to do it in a way that's engaging. And for Black Friday, when everyone was saying don't buy this, everyone was saying buy this, they came out and said don't buy this. Super brave, really impactful, boosted their sales by 30%, and obviously kind of drove brand awareness as well. But yeah, I just love that as a campaign of just being able to kind of stand out, and who better to do it than Patagonia.
Brilliant, thank you, Carol. So a product, an architectural, and a campaign example there, and yeah, that Patagonia one keeps coming back. It's a real touch point in our industry for sure. Tom, over to you. Same question.
Thank you, and so glad Carol started that much more coherent response than me. But no, I think it's a really good point, and I think I completely agree with Carol. Is in like there are the basics of good design, which are, you know, a piece of design, whether it's architecture, graphic design, which is where we're more involved with, sort of fulfills a task. It helps signpost someone, or, you know, it helps make their job easier, or helps sell something. So I think that is the principle of good design, and it often gets overlooked. But I think what's the problem is there is good design for bad things. And in fact, I would say probably the last 40 years, like the best design has been for businesses and brands who are driving hyperconsumption. So it's almost principles of good design have been applied in order to keep us desiring faster, bigger cars, to keep us craving fatty, unhealthy foods. And those principles of good designs have been used to kind of manipulate our behaviors. So it's almost good design for bad causes. Whereas I think where, at least with my role at Nice and Serious, we've over the last 15 years or so have tried to focus on is good design for good causes, because I think unfortunately for whatever reason the environmental sector in general has almost been synonymous for bad design for good causes, sort of very worthy, entitled design and messaging, which unfortunately hasn't engaged mass audiences, and as a result we haven't switched to more sustainable behavior change. So, you know, I've always been, and it's always the thing that's really motivated me, is like, how can we get awesome design to help brands who are doing good things, to help charities who are trying to create change, and use those principles that have been adopted by the advertising industry for decades, but to create positive change instead. And I think one of the examples that still sticks out for me was a project we developed called Useless London, where, you know, there are hundreds of these zero waste shops popping up around London, but the problem is often the people who run them don't have backgrounds in design, aren't able to attract people to their doorsteps because they can't afford the premium real estate which is dominated by supermarkets. So, you know, we literally just came up with a simple idea: well, let's create a zero waste directory of all the shops in London, but let's make it look awesome. Let's give everyone the same look and feel, a really beautiful aesthetic. Let's make sure that we signpost the sorts of products they stop, where they're based, so you can search by postcode borough, things like that. And let's make the copy fun, inviting. Let's make the design appealing. And just by applying those principles of good design for a good cause, you just get hundreds of thousands more visitors and traffic to those sites because you've used those principles, which so often the good causes aren't able to access. And for me, that sums it up. If you make the behavior change desirable and look cooler than the alternative, then you're more likely going to get people wanting to do that action. And I just think that simple principle gets overlooked so much when it comes to design. So yeah, that's it from me.
Brilliant, thanks, Tom. Definitely resonates with our mission at Hubbub as well, to apply best possible commercial quality design to good causes. You mentioned the refill campaign site. Where can people find that if it's still live?
Oh, yeah, if you just search useless London or useless, I think it should come up and still be live. I'll pop it in the chat.
Thanks, Tom. And before I move on to the second question, just for anyone who's joined us a little bit later, we're going to move to a Q&A soon, and there's a Q&A box at the bottom where you can enter your questions for our guests. So please do pop them in there, and we will get to those soon. So next up, I'd like to know what influence great design can have on people, and maybe with some examples too. And Eric, I'm going to come to you.
Cool, thanks, Alex. I think this is a good follow-on from what Carol and Tom were just talking about. I think in Hubbub, the sort of influence that we hope great design can have is probably about in 3 areas. So the first is meeting people where they're at. So it's about looking at, you know, the geography, the backgrounds, the languages they speak, the kind of tone that we should be using. What do they care about? And you have to start looking at it from that perspective. The second thing is about being as specific as possible. And this is sort of connected to meeting people where they're at. And people can think that being specific is non-inclusive. It's actually the opposite. So being as specific as possible allows you to actually target a specific audience. And therefore, you're more likely to actually engage them and you know, encourage them to have a sustainable behavior change. There's a principle in design called designing for all is designing for none. And I think it's very applicable, because as soon as you average out everything in your design to try and address everyone, you're actually attracting no one. And so I think the way you link the being specific as possible allows you to actually meet people, you know, where they're at. There's also a concept of designing for the extremes allows you to design for the mainstream. And I think Carol's example beautifully showed that, where they were designing a bottle for visually impaired people, but ended up seeing that, oh, it was great for you know, kids. It was great for people with shampoo in their eyes. We've seen the same thing with like subtitles, originally designed for hearing impairment, but everyone uses subtitles these days. So when you design for a specific audience, it allows you to then scale up to a mainstream audience. I think the last thing that great design, the influencer can have, is touching on Tom's point. And it's about borrowing from established brand and marketing campaigns. When you look at someone and you're trying to influence them, you need to look at what are the other influences in their lives. So they do not live in an environmental bubble. The information they're getting is from all the well-known brands and companies that we have. So it's how do you borrow their tools and techniques? How do you take their approach to great design and then use it for a more, you know, environmental message? And I think that's a key aspect. An example I can give you from Hubbub's campaign is a campaign called Manchester is Green. And it's basically, it's looking at how do we cut meat consumption. So the major insight is that, you know, men are bigger meat eaters as a population in the UK than women. And that's probably, when you look at how do you meet people where they're at, we actually have this quote of a guy saying that no one wants to be the guy in the pub ordering a veggie burger. So that's their thinking. That's where they're coming from. So you're not going to attract them to a traditional message. The other thing that when you look at, okay, so now we have men feeling this way, is that football can be such a good hook to men in the UK. It's the most followed and played sport in the UK. And so that's how you can get specific. Let's talk about football fans within this male demographic. And so ultimately, borrowing from advertising, borrowing from traditional marketing, we created a campaign which uses football as a hook to gamify eating more sustainable diets. pitting Manchester fans against each other and sort of making this a challenge that they have to step up to. And I mean, the impact of that project was pretty great in terms of over 70% eating less meat, more plant-based, and over 83% wasting less food. So I think there is a knack to this approach.
Brilliant, thank you, Eric. I'm going to come to you, Carol. What influence can great design have on people?
I think at its best, it can change behaviour. And one of my favourite ever innocent projects, which I worked on with Hubbub actually, was the recycling campaign we did for our local borough, for rural borough of Kensington and Chelsea. The recycling rates were really low in the area, and we partnered to do some design work for recycling bags, to brand up the vehicles and do some leaflets as well. I think recycling it's so boring and it's really hard. And I think I couldn't believe it. We went to kind of see a recycling kind of plant and to see kind of the process behind it. But when you look at the different boroughs and you see how we're recycling in different ways, and then you look at the UK generally and, what's recycling, in Newcastle, where I'm from, compared to what's recycled in London, it's so difficult to understand. So you have to keep it simple for people. And I think as well, if you're not a native English speaker, trying to understand recycling is just quite literally, it's so impossible. So we did a campaign using kind of our unexpected tone of voice around the most wanted. So we almost did it like a Western style poster. And we focused on the stuff that people weren't recycling. So we kept it really kind of single-minded. What aren't people recycling? And it was mainly bathroom products. So yeah, we did some kind of illustrations around that and then branded everything up. But I think one of the key things is that if you're gonna talk about sustainability or environmental impact, you need to do it in a way that is a bit more unexpected or a bit more playful if you can. It's hard because it's such a serious subject. But if you just bombard people with science, you're going to talk to a really small audience, and you just risking people switching off as well. So you have to find a way to be inclusive of as many people as you possibly can.
Brilliant, thank you, Carol. And yeah, I mean, if communicating the science was the answer, we would have solved so many problems by now. So, okay, so last question from me before we move on to the crowdsourced questions, which I can see coming through on the Q&A. How do you go about approaching your sustainability goals through design? Tom?
Yeah, this is, I think this is a question on everyone's lips at the moment. I think at the moment in the sector, in general, when it comes to sort of brands talking about sustainability, there's a lot of fear around greenwashing, about saying the wrong thing. And as a result, what we're seeing is a lot of people holding back, and instead of going to good design principles, they're almost communicating from a position of fear, for fear of getting it wrong. And as a result, they're over relying on jargon and science. And a lot of what we're seeing ends up kind of reading like terms and conditions versus good communications and creativity because of a fear of getting it wrong. And I think the new greenwashing guidelines I think are great. Obviously, they're there for a good reason, which is to kind of make sure that brands are accurate. And obviously, there are brands in the past that have tried to sort of almost like use environmental claims to distract from what they're really doing. But I think what's been a shame is the more progressive brands have actually almost had to take a step back from communicating. But ultimately, I think if brands are seriously committed, have demonstrated action towards sustainability and their strategy, then they need to jump in with 2 feet and keep talking, keep communicating, because we don't have time to hold back. But I think when we get a brief and we're asked to help an organization communicate their sustainability kind of initiatives, I think obviously we start from a principle of what are you doing, what you're saying first, because if what you're doing isn't backed up by action, then all we're doing is communicating a strategy, which has a place. But I think some organizations can get too caught up in just talking about their 2030, 2040 strategy. And while that perhaps needs to happen at the start, I think quite quickly it needs to kind of transition into communicate, well, what are you doing on the ground? And I think to the points discussed by Eric and Carol, like the more specific and the more tangible the kind of subject that you're talking about, the more rich and more vibrant the communications become. Because I think there's a tendency for people, when they start talking about sustainability or climate, to want to communicate everything in one hit, to want to be like, right, we're talking about sustainability policy, therefore we need to talk about our 4 pillars, we need to explain what we're doing in each one, we need to go target data, blah. Like, and obviously all that means is you should end up with some really dull, really formulaic piece of creative, versus going right for a specific detail which illustrates the bigger point of what you're doing as a business. So find that story within your factories, within your supply chain, something that's happening on the ground that illustrates this kind of change that you're creating in the system, and tell that story, because that demonstrates progress towards that bigger goal. So it's about keeping it simple, keeping it human wherever possible. We just generally see that any story involving a person is going to resonate better. So go for those kind of tangible little stories, even if it feels like you're not telling the bigger picture. It's sort of my belief that we need to almost create this patchwork of what change looks like, rather than trying to paint the Sistine Chapel in one piece of creative. Just kind of tell micro stories that are kind of almost more atomic in impact, and then we'll build up that bigger vision of what a better world looks like. So it's about being human, being detailed, and not being scared to say everything in every piece of communications you do. So does that make sense, or have I just been ranting?
No, that was brilliant, Tom. And I think there was so much good stuff in there. But one thing that really leaps out, that really chimes with everything we've learned as well, is the need to find the specific thing to focus on that will resonate and that will illustrate the wider point, rather than trying to communicate everything at once. And please don't talk about your pillars in public. They can stay behind closed doors. That's wonderful, thank you. So I'm going to move into the Q&A section. We have questions coming through. So first off, I'm going to come to the question from Zarino Zapier at My Society, that our response to climate change is often framed as an individual challenge. You need to do this. It could be disempowering, because it's hard sometimes to think about, well, can I make a difference on my own? So can you think of any good examples of design solutions that encourage a communal response to climate action or sustainability challenges that involve people coming together? Who wants to take this?
I'm happy to take it.
Oh, Carol.
Or Eric.
I thought Eric was coming in, but
no, Carol, please go ahead. I can take it up.
Yeah, happy to chat through. We had the big Rewild campaign last year across Europe, and that was all about our carbon neutral orange juice. And the campaign we worked on obviously was from Innocent, but it was all about trying to get people involved with rewilding as well. And we totally get it. It's, I think we can all relate to the comment that's been made in that question around it. It feels like such a challenge individually to try and make an impact ourselves. But I think one of the strengths of Innocent as a brand, and any brand really, is around bringing people together. That's what we've got to focus on: bring people together, build a community, so that you've got a network of people who you can bounce ideas around with, maybe even create a bit of competition. So if you've rewilded whatever it is, if you've not got a garden, I haven't. I rewilded my front windowsill. But yeah, having competition with your neighbour around that, get people talking and just getting it on people's radar. But it can be frustrating sometimes, because it does feel like it's an impossible challenge. But I think it really is up to brands and up to creatives as well, is to create these communities and bring people together. And I'm seeing more of it, which is great.
Excellent, thanks, Carol. Eric, did you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah, sure, Alex. I think one of the best examples is one of our biggest projects, which is community fridges, where essentially, again, it's important to to know that when Hubbub approaches these topics, because Hubbub is all about individual action, it's about connecting that to the wider, bigger picture. And sustainability or your impact is not the end goal. There's always so many other things that you can gain along the way, and there's so many other benefits for you. And so Community Fridges, for instance, is a campaign that we have probably 400, 500 fridges across the UK, where essentially people can share food, and it prevents food from going to waste. And so there is a knock-on environmental effect, which is huge, preventing so much food from going to waste. But the communal aspect is actually what's enabling these to thrive and to grow so widely. It's people are coming together, sharing food. We're adding on more social elements to it, like cooking classes, upskilling, and ultimately you see this coming together then encourages a lot more behavior. So it's the communal aspect is very important as well.
Thanks, Eric. And maybe there's a challenge for creatives and companies there as well, not always to think we need to appeal to people's kind of most self-centered instincts, and that you can be effective in your campaigns by appealing to people's kind of more generous and community-minded sides. Tom, were you?
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
No, I just think it's a great question from Zarino. And for me, that this goes back to the very origins of what we're fighting against here, where you have essentially the and a lot of you will know this, but the term the carbon footprint was developed by the oil industry in the 90s to try and shift blame away from the system towards the individual, to make us feel like actually it's about us reducing car use and reducing, rather than the entire economic system which is underpinned by oil. So I think from that point in time, it's all been about individual action, doing your bit. Whereas I think we're at this real turning point now where we have to move away from the individual to the collective, as Zarino sort of highlighted there. And that I just think, and again, we're also fighting against a media that is looking to divide and sort of make us feel kind of like isolated and individual. So there's a lot going against us. But I think some of the best campaigns that I have seen use techniques to try and break down barriers and remind us of our common interests, our common humanity. And I do think I think some of the work that Hubbub's been doing recently is a perfect example of that. The community fridges, the ballot bins, which I'm hoping you guys will talk about too. But even just a little one we worked on recently for refugee action as just a way to kind of break down barriers. We just came up with this idea called Homemade, and it was basically getting refugees to write recipe kits for people and having that as a subscription box. Just the using common things like food or humor or stuff that breaks down barriers and reminds us of our common humanity can really help us move past some of those blockers and barriers and just build that sense of togetherness. So it's almost like trying to find those little Trojan horses around culture, around food, around humor or laughter that sort of break down all the BS and remind us that we're actually a fundamentally social, community-orientated species that can work through these problems. But yeah, so no, I think it's a great question.
Thanks, Tom. And you touched on carbon footprints there, and we have a question kind of related to that, which is someone asking about carbon labeling on products. Is there evidence that it works? And what do you think about it? I think maybe Carol, this is perhaps one you might have thought about.
I certainly thought about it. I don't have, unfortunately, any evidence that it works. I haven't got the facts and figures. But I think it must work to an extent because I'm a consumer of these things. Oatly's a good example. But I think Oatly's a great example of a product that tastes really great. So I'm not a vegan, but I'll drink oat milk because I like the taste of it, and also it's reassuring when I see their little call out of their carbon call outs, and you see it more and more across packaging. I think we talked about this at the very start, is making things really simple for people. The worst thing you could possibly do is when you've got that call out on the front of pack and then you've got 3 or 4 other things on the packaging also kind of competing with each other. So if you're going to do it well and make that your thing. But yeah, Tom, Eric, I don't know if you've got any ideas about kind of the evidence of that, particularly across packaging.
Absolutely zero evidence, but hopefully a good talk, a good game. But no, I think, you know, that there are obviously, I mean, standards exist for a reason. They're kind of a shorthand to give people confidence that something's going right. You know, obviously, Carol, Innocent, they're a certified B Corp. We're a certified B Corp. It kind of gives that third-party verification that we need to say to clients that we have committed, it's verified, we are doing what we can to reduce our environmental impact. So I certainly think there is kind of room for that. I've had mixed opinions over the years around like carbon labeling, because I was sort of thinking, well, if you put X grams of carbon on a product, do people really understand that? But I had a really interesting chat recently with the founder of Allbirds, the B Corp shoe company, who they carbon label their products. And what was really interesting, he sort of said that we put it on our products. He was like, I'm not really sure people care about it, but he said it actually gives this really interesting creative design constraint for his shoe designers, because as opposed to just having aesthetics or weight or cost of material, they have this new dimension, which is carbon, and they're trying to drive down the carbon footprint of shoes. So he said from a creative perspective, it's resulted in all kinds of new styles of design, use of material, and that's almost driving their aesthetic and their innovation more so than, say, cost and stuff like that. So I think almost there could be something interesting in kind of having carbon as a common metric or language for innovation and design going forward. I think I've slightly taken that question off track.
Yeah, but
I think it was an interesting one.
I guess it speaks to a classic thing, right? Which is that a constraint can often be a spur to creativity in design, right? Having a totally open brief is not necessarily what you want. I'm going to combine a couple of questions that we've had. One from Amy Jones and one from Kana Alam, which is about, we've talked about coming from unexpected angles, not sounding like you're just reeling off terms and conditions when you communicate sustainability. And lots of the work that you guys do involves storytelling and also a sense of play. So how do you balance that needing to get across a serious message with being playful, telling stories? And how do you think about the balance between those two things? And maybe I will come to, well, Carol, you're not on mute, so I'm going to come to you first.
Okay. It's a good a reason as any. Innocent's kind of, renowned and quite famous for its tone of voice, and it's not easy when you're trying to talk about things like sustainability. One of the things that we did last year around the big rewild, we had some media space at train stations, huge billboards. And we had a big conversation within kind of creative team and the marketing team about what we want to put on those billboards. And copywriter in my team, a very talented guy called Gary, he came up with a headline, which was a big plate of grey broccoli as a huge headline. And people were a bit like, oh, what? And I'm like, no, this is it, because this is the hook, because people will be like, why have Innocent written about a big plate of grey broccoli at a train station? And because you've got a bit more dwell time there, you can read a bit more about the story, what we're doing with the big rewilds, find out a bit more about the campaign. But I think it's not about being kind of random or gimmicky or, forcing a smile, because you've got to have the intelligence in there. And it's really hard to get that intelligence. And it's essentially wit that you're trying to get, but you've also got to have kind of the knowledge about what will work for certain audiences. Sometimes it's not right to be playful or unexpected. Sometimes it is serious, and you've just got to be quite straight down the line with it. But I think it's all about your media choices as well, where you're showing up. If you're going to show up on TikTok, that's very different to if you're going to show up on a website somewhere else, or, a piece of out of home. I was going to say something else, but I've completely lost my train of thought, so I'll just leave it there. Pass over to someone else.
No, that's perfect. I'm going to move on to another. We've got so many good questions. We're not going to have time to go for them all, so I might pick up the pace a little bit. Eric, I'm going to come to you with this one. So sustainability campaigns often preach to the already converted. This is very true. How important is it when designing a campaign to identify and perhaps lead with secondary benefits that might appeal to a different audience, saving money or time, for example?
That's such a good question, Alex, and I'm sure you know the answer that I'm going to give, because I think in Hubbub, we know that sustainability can't be the USP. You can't lead with that because our target audience is most often the mainstream audience, the not converted. And so if you think about it, if someone already cares enough to make that change, they change. And so it's like, how do you get people who do not care as much, who aren't aware enough, and how do you get them to start caring? So in Hubbub, our hook, or whatever the creative route and the USP of the campaign, it usually is something other than leading with the primary stat, environmental stat, or whatever that might be. And it's getting people through, how do you save money? How do you, pick up a new skill? How do you try something new? How do you, come together and give it a go in a way? And that's what we say in Hubbub. So an example of this could be, we just launched a fashion campaign called Off the Hanger, where we found that over a quarter of people's wardrobes remain unused. But when digging in a little bit deeper, we find out that people's major quote is, I have so many clothes, but nothing to wear. So what people are actually looking for is like new looks. That's why they're going out and shopping. And like young adults shop almost every month. About 80% of them shop every month. So if you go to them with the angle of like fashion is one of the biggest polluters, stop buying clothes, that doesn't really solve their problem. Their problem is, how do I still feel like I have fresh looks? And so our entire campaign was based on that. It's about, how do you re-love your wardrobe? How do you go back in there and fall in love with the pieces that you already own? And so I think that's like the trick that Hubbub uses to then achieve our sustainability goal, which is obviously shopping less.
Brilliant. Thanks, Eric. Another question, this one's from Emily Brown. As impact can be quite intangible, how do you measure the impact of your work, and how does that influence your design processes and practices? Who wants to take this?
I've spoken a lot, so I'm passing over to Tom. I've answered loads. I feel like I've talked a lot.
Tom's coming in.
Like Carol might have more data behind this than I ever would, but so sometimes, right, you work on a really great brief where there's a really tangible like objective. So I've worked on briefs where it's like, our brief is to engage 50 backbench Conservative MPs with this message. It's like brilliant, really easy to measure. Or sometimes you might be working for a big charity and it's the end goal is political change. Like we worked on the big UNEA plastics treaty that went through last year, and it was about campaigning to get that. And if the treaty goes through, you obviously outlandishly claim that it was all your responsibility, not the hard work of decades of campaigning. But so there are really tangible projects like that. But then often you're working on something more intangible, like if we're doing a rebrand, or if we're kind of trying to create awareness around something, unless money is invested to do background research before and after on unprompted brand awareness or things like that, it's really hard to measure your impact. And I think too often we resort to vanity metrics like the number of likes or shares, which is obviously an indication, but you can kind of pay for that stuff anyway. So yeah, I mean, obviously I think it starts with working with the team to try and set some meaningful objectives that you can actually measure at a reasonable cost, and perhaps to Eric's point, get really focused on who are you actually trying to change, and can you be more specific with that subset so that you can actually measure the impact of your work, because it is it can be a real challenge. But I don't know, I mean, I feel like you folks at Hubbub are kind of you're all about behavior change, so I think you'll have some better insights than me.
And I suspect we do, but Eric, I'm going to hold off because we have so many good questions, and not so much time. A practical one that might give people some some actionable tips to take away. This is a question from Vethi. Are there any frameworks or tools that you use to design impactful campaigns and comms? Eric.
Cool. Yeah, there is a framework that we have. It's a very loose blueprint we call the Hubbub way. And essentially, I mean, through this conversation, I've sort of touched upon different aspects, but it starts with, it's basically like this scope, discover, create, experiment, and scale. And so it's quite similar to a lot of design methods out there. But essentially what it allows us to do is literally have phases where we focus on a particular piece of work. So we'll start with obviously scoping out the issue, the environmental issue, the partners that share the same ambition as us. And then we go on to discover, where we look at our audience. We sort of narrow it down, dig into insights, all of that. Create the campaign, where we bring that all together, have all the brainstorms, the entire ideation happens there. And then, super important, we experiment. So we always put something out there, we test and try and measure it. As Tom said, it can be hard, but then we always try and then scale it to a wider audience.
Great, thanks, Eric. And do you know of any publicly available kind of frameworks or ways of leading people through that design thinking process if they haven't done it before?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is quite similar to a lot of design methodologies. So if you like go to IDEO, for instance, they have a really great design thinking toolkit, which sort of gives you this and a lot more, which you can like practical information that you can implement.
Perfect. I hoped you were going to say that, Eric. Carol, you were going to come in on this.
Yeah, just a tool that we're trialing at the moment. It's called the loops, and it's just a really quick way of if you've got some ideas, kind of as rough as you like, really, you can put them into this website called the loops, and it'll give you feedback in around kind of 24 to 48 hours, and you can test it with people. I think globally we're using it across Europe at the moment. It's fairly cost effective, but it's a really good way if you've got some rough thinking, particularly if you're going to go and present to your client, and you just want to sense check it with, 100 people, a couple hundred people, just on a really small scale, then it's a really good way. You can write your own kind of questions, get your own prompts, and then it uses AI to kind of collate all of those answers together and give you the key themes. So we've just been testing on a couple of things just internally at the moment, but I've been quite impressed with kind of how cost effective it is, and the team are able to use that data to then go into like pitches basically, and say, do you know what, we've done a very small scale test here. This is a bit of a red flag, but actually there's something really interesting over here. So this is what we're going to develop. So it's just, quite a good, easy sense check.
Brilliant, Carol. That's called the loops. That sounds incredibly helpful. I can already think of one or two things we might use that for. And I'm going to ask just a couple of quick fire questions to wrap up. One is from Peter Brown. Could you give us an example of great design for circularity?
I think Wild deodorant are a great example of that. I think the product was designed by Studio Marama, but just a great example of slot in, slot out deodorant, simple design system, beautiful product, and now they're expanding into different kind of plastic-free alternatives. I don't know if that's technically circular, but I think there's lots of interesting subscription reuse models that I think are kind of pushing design at the moment, which I'm love following. I'm a sucker for a subscription.
It's certainly very low waste, and they have a kind of chocolate one now, which is interesting too. Carol or Eric, do you have one?
I think there's lots of really great examples within the fashion industry now, which is great because that is such a problematic industry. Again, I'm not sure if this is quite the right example, and I can't also remember exactly what it's called, but there's a company called Productive Change, which works specifically within the branding and licensing entertainment industry. And they've just done an article about recycling old broken plastic toys and turn them into books. And I think it's with Tesco that they're doing it. So worth Google if anyone wants to find out more. But yeah, Productive Change, Tesco, Google that, and it should come up. But I found that really interesting.
Love that. Thanks, Carol. I'm going to move on to the last question for each of you. For people who'd like to learn more about this topic, could you recommend one thing that they should read, watch, or listen to?
Try to kick us off. Got this book with me because I didn't want to forget the title. It's called The Future Normal, and it's about how we'll live, work, and thrive in the next decade. And it's all about possible futures, and it covers a whole load of different topics. So it's about, they've got some examples of doctors prescribing nature instead of tablets for people across Europe, and some case studies around that. It's got how we can kind of fight loneliness by developing different types of architecture. And at the end of every chapter, it's got three kind of provoking questions, and it's really good for getting your mind into that unexpected way of thinking and thinking, you know what, if this future did happen in 10 years, what would happen to a brand like Innocent? But what would happen to me? How would I change the way I'm living? How would I change what I'm consuming? And even better, the chapters are quite short, so it's perfect for a commute. So yeah, highly recommend it, The Future Normal.
Nice, thank you, Carol. Eric.
Thanks, Alex. I think a book that might not be on too many people's radar, but it's a very practical book on the design process. It's called The Mom Test by Rob Fitzpatrick. If you haven't heard of it, it's a very simple premise. It's essentially the way we talk to our audience, and we try and investigate, their problems or ideas. Often can result in us asking questions that are very leading or don't actually give us meaningful results. Like, would you do this would you recycle if I did this? Everyone's going to say yes. And so the Mom Test basically gives you a framework by which you can investigate so that even your mom can't lie to you. That's the premise of it. So check it out.
Thanks, Eric. The Mom Test by Rob Fitzpatrick. Thank you. And Tom.
Just in thinking of this question, there's not that many books out there in this space. I feel like maybe you guys should get together and write one. But yeah, just I think if people are interested more in or communicating environmental issues, sustainability, there's a strategist called John Grant who's written a few books. The most recent one's called Greener Marketing, and I think it's just a good broad look at the different tactics that brands use, different approaches, some of the impacts, and what good looks like. I think that's a good kind of starting point, I would say, if people are interested in that area.
Brilliant. Greener Marketing by John Grant.
John Grant, yeah.
John Grant, thank you very much. Well, thank you so much for those recommendations. Thank you to all of you for joining us today as well. I really appreciate it. And so today we kicked off, this is the first of a new series of breakfast events that are all about engaging the public, changing behaviours around sustainability. The next one is going to be around how behavioural insight can fuel your sustainability campaign. So if you're interested in behaviour change and the thinking behind that, then I hope you won't miss that. So if you'd like to receive an invite for that, or you have any questions you wish you'd asked, please drop your details into the form, which Rebecca is posting in the chat, or perhaps has just posted in the chat. We'll also follow up with a recording of this session and a link to our newsletter, Hubbub, which will keep you up to date with news, events, campaign launches, insights, and things like that, should you want it. No spam, I promise. So that just leaves me to say thank you to everyone who's joined us. Thank you for asking such excellent questions. I'm sorry that we couldn't get to all of them. I feel like we could have gone on for another hour or two. And I hope that you've enjoyed it, that you've taken something away with you from it that you'll find valuable, and you feel a bit fired up to make a difference in the day ahead. So thank you very much, everyone, and see you next time.